Hi. Today we will be starting our final topic, which is applied anthropology. We've been spending all semester talking about anthropology. How do we do what we do? What do we study? And so, what do anthropologists actually know? Does it matter? And can they help? This is this informal fifth field of applied anthropology, which is all about using knowledge gained from research in the other four subfields and then applying that towards solving contemporary human problems, be it social or environmental. We've been discussing the past few weeks poverty, inequality, and these vast social problems humans are facing. On top of that, we're also facing some mounting environmental challenges as well. And so today, what do anthropologists know? Does it matter? And how can we help? And again, this is sort of this fifth informal field of anthropology called applied anthropology, which is aimed at using research gained from the other four subfields and then applying that towards solving contemporary human problems. To do anthropology, a hallmark method is we go do field work, meaning we go out long-term in situ and live and work with the people participating in the research, the people we're studying, if you will. You learn the language, you stay for a long time, you live in their homes, you sort of do what they do. And one of the byproducts of long-term on-site field work is you end up making pretty strong attachments to the people that you work with. Anthropologists make attachments, have relationships with the people that they're working with, the people that are participating in the research. We care about them, right? We develop relationships with them. We generally want to help. These on the slide is pictures of my own research in Solomon Islands, specifically Titiana. On the top right, that's Timorese, that's Carita, my research assistant and close friend, my sister. That's her mom. Her little sister Pauline taking a bath. She's like 10 years old now. And then Katita, her other sister. That's them doing laundry. That's how you do laundry in the village, right? Water and hand wash. And I still stay in touch with Carita. We talk through Facebook and email. I will consider her a sister forever. Actually, her firstborn kid, she named Savannah, which for those of you that don't know, that's my first name. And so you develop these really strong attachments with the people that you work with. You genuinely care and typically want to help. The rub, the dilemma, is that typically anthropological subjects, the people that are participating in the research being studied, usually it's people that are in small scale, usually poor societies, that are uncomfortably attached in one way or another to larger, more powerful societies through the global market economy or colonial past, whatever it may be. We're all sort of connected via globalization, but in different ways. And so there's this inherent power dynamic, this power difference when you're doing fieldwork, meaning the anthropologist has an unusual, an uncomfortable amount of power and status relative to other people in the village. You're an outsider, usually white, associated with wealth in my case, right, coming to America. And so people will sort of talk to you when they otherwise might not. You can get people to talk about things that they otherwise wouldn't. And you have to be really careful about this. Make sure you're not creating more damage or harm to them and having them relive their experiences. This was a big thing when I was my first field season in Solomons in 2011. I was collecting data on what happened after the tsunami, and one of the questions I was asking was, did you lose anyone? We were trying to get a full count of who died and also age and gender. And unfortunately, a lot of the people that died, Titiana had the highest mortality rate in the entire country. They lost something like 12 or 13, 15 villagers out of 50 people in the whole country. And so when we were going around asking these questions, when you ask people to relive that trauma, to talk about stuff, that can cause psychological damage. So you have to be really careful about that. The rule is sort of do no harm. And so if you notice people being affected or by that in some sort of adverse way, you want to mitigate that. Move away from that question. You have to be really careful. You do have this extra power to kind of get people to talk about stuff. Make sure you use that in an appropriate way, right? And don't end up harming people with it. So actually, this kind of happened to me. Someone started crying during one of the interviews. If you look at the picture down on the bottom left, in the middle, there's Myra. That's who we are interviewing. And Myra, she lost like three or four people from the tsunami. A couple of, like, one of her children and a couple of small nieces, I think, that got hit on the head by a canoe that fell when the earthquake and tsunami came. And then her husband passed away shortly thereafter. So just massive loss. And so she's sort of telling us about who and the ages, 3 and 4 years old. And she starts tearing up. And Carita is off to the right in the picture. You can see her wiping her eyes. She was tearing up too. And I'm taking the picture, and I also start tearing up at this point. She's telling us about this traumatic life history, what had happened. And another thing about Titiana is when I first came out there, so you'll notice I'm a little bit higher up than Carita and Myra. I'm sitting on a chair. And so anytime I would go to do interviews, if the people had a chair in their house, and you don't sit on chairs in the village, you sit low floor, right? Your ass and your back hurts really bad for a couple of weeks, and then you get used to it. And then it's hard to come home and sit on a couch. That's actually uncomfortable. And so I'm sitting on this chair doing this interview. When you go do interviews, outside, white girl, they will give you a chair if they have one. And it's because that's what Americans do. That's what white people do. They sit on chairs. They eat with forks. And so people in the village, it's an uncomfortable situation where they're trying to provide you with what they think you need to be comfortable. And then all of a sudden, you're the only one sitting on a chair out of 20 people. Everyone else is sitting on the ground. It's really uncomfortable, but also you can't say no. Because then it's like, oh, what's wrong? My chair's not good enough, or this person's not comfortable here. So you have to kind of play along. I had to take the chair. By the second time, the second field season out there, I was able to sort of not sit on the chair and sit on the ground with everyone else. But it's this uncomfortable power dynamic. And so we're interviewing Myra. She starts to tear up. Carita starts to cry. I start to cry. And I just couldn't sit on this fucking chair above eye level to these people that are telling me the inside of their hearts. And so I got down, I kind of crept off the chair and got down onto the ground. And Myra, she stops. She starts talking, and she looks at me concerned, and she says, she's talking about her children, her father, her husband that died. And I get down off this fucking chair. And she says, is everything okay? Is something wrong with the chair? Right? Really, really uncomfortable power dynamic. And I said, no, the chair is fine. And I tried to explain the best I could that I can't sit here and be in this situation where people are getting emotional talking about this stuff and sit on this chair above everyone. I just couldn't. And they let me sit on the ground. But there's this uncomfortable power dynamic that has to be dealt with. The picture on the bottom left, that's up in 3 Mile. That's a village that was created after the tsunami. Part of Titiana, well, everyone in Titiana went up onto the hill. Many migrated back down to their original village site. Some people still live up on the hill. They're scared to come back down. So you live out here for a long time, and you get close with the people that you're working with. And so even if you're the best anthropologist, respectful, unintrusive, mitigating these power differences that exist, making sure you're not asking people to talk about stuff that's causing them damage. I got a lot out of my research, right? I wrote my thesis. I got my master's degree. I teach at San Diego State in Palomar. I've published in peer-reviewed journals. I got a lot from it, both professionally and personally. What did the villagers actually get? What did people in Titiana and Pailongue get? And the answer is hopefully something, right? Hopefully the results of that research will help mitigate future disasters or aid distribution problems in the region should this happen again. But only time will tell, right? I got tangible benefits. What did they tangibly get? And so where we're headed is, some would say anthropology, anthropological research and applied work, coming in, taking this knowledge, getting tangible benefits from it. Is this really any different than powerful outsiders colonial countries, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the projects, these development projects, powerful outsiders coming in and influencing local cultures. Is anthropology really any different? Or is it just another form of neocolonialism, sort of powerful outsiders coming in, influencing the lives of others, and taking? And so really there's several dilemmas. First, should we even get involved as anthropologists, given that we are more powerful outsiders, that we have influence in ways we may not perceive, or should we respect these groups' autonomy? If we do decide to get involved, whose side should we be on? And so some in anthropology, there's a divide. Some would say that the field should be strictly research-based and theoretical. This is science. This is objectivity. As soon as you step over the line into advocacy or applied work or mediating or trying to help, you are no longer objective. You are inherently subjective because you have a goal in mind, and that will bias the results of your research. So people disagree. Some say it should be strictly research. Some should say it should be applied. I think I favor both. I think the research is good, but also the applied. If you go in and do only research and don't do any applied work, then is it really any different than neocolonialism coming in and sort of taking? And so if you do get involved, whose side should you be on? There's multiple stakeholders. Communities are not homogenous. Are you on the side of the local government that's trying to institute a conservation initiative to save the coral reefs? Are you on the side of the local villagers that rely on those coral reefs for fishing, for subsistence? Are you on the side of the NGO that's trying to develop a conservation initiative or ecotourism so that people can still make cash from tourism, but no longer putting pressure on the reefs from fishing? Are you on the side of the funder of the NGO? The people funding the non-government organization project are often don't have the same goals as the people actually working for the NGO. What about within the village? Villages themselves are not homogenous. The people within them do not all agree on what they need or want. Do you talk to just the chief? Do you talk to the poorest person in the village, the most marginalized? If you talk to the chief, you're going to get a very different answer than if you go talk to the poorest villagers. In Pailongue, one of the villages I worked on in Gizo, they have a chief. And you know what he wanted? He wanted the church rebuilt. They have this big-ass concrete church for some reason. Someone else must have come in and built it years ago, and the tsunami wiped it out. He wanted the church rebuilt. Do you think that's what the poorest villagers that barely had a roof over their head and could barely eat wanted? No, they wanted housing. They wanted canoes so they could go fishing. And so multiple interests, multiple stakeholders. Whose side should you be on? You can see something that seems simple, we want to help, can become very complex very quickly. And should we be mediators? Should we be advocates? Or should we be activists? What should our role be as anthropologists? And given that, what role we take, what happens to our scientific objectivity? Again, some argue anth should be strictly research, theoretically oriented. This is the only way to make it scientific. Advocacy inherently means you're biased, you're in favor of something. But others would say, again, to not become involved truly makes us colonial, in the sense that only we are really gaining from the situation. Again, I tend to favor both. And you know what? At least in anthropology, anthropologists admit their bias, admit there is subjectivity that enters into their interpretations. People that say they're not biased at all, be very wary of the conclusions that they come up with. What about traditional culture? If the main goal of anthropology and ethnography is to document and understand different cultures, how do we observe them if we're simultaneously there influencing them? Do I explain them in the traditional sense, like the Kung pre-reservation, or the modern contemporary sense? For example, in Solomon Islands and Titiana, one of the questions I asked was, what religious affiliation do you belong to? Because that was potentially one of the networks along which aid may have flowed. That ended up not being super important in the end, but we didn't know. This was before we really knew about the one-talk system. And so they'll tell you they're Christian or Catholic or various sects of Christianity. But late at night, they'll also tell you stories about Kastam, the old religion, the old way. I think I've mentioned a few of them to you before. One time I had a bad dream, and the person I was staying with said, because you were on someone else's land last night when it was getting dark, the ancestor spirits protecting that land might have followed you home. That's probably why you had really fucked up dreams. My words, not his. And all the while they're telling you this, they will say, but we don't believe this. We don't believe this. But there's this custom. But there's this belief. But we don't practice that now. We're Christian. But, right? So do I report simply the emic that they're Christian, or do I report on my observations, the edict, these kind of cool anecdotes and stories they're telling me about the custom religion, right? If the goal is to give a voice to those that don't typically have one, small-scale marginalized societies, what account of Solomon Island culture do I privilege, right? The emic, or do I add my edict observations? It's an unresolved issue. Is anthropology just another form of neocolonialism? Again, meaning more powerful outsiders, anthropologists coming into less powerful, poor, small-scale groups and extracting, taking in the form of knowledge, information, data. Again, I got a lot from my research, personally and professionally. What did they gain? And again, hopefully a voice, advocacy, improved future situations, but only time will tell. The benefits I got, those are tangible. Those exist now. Okay, so because much of traditional ways of life of small-scale and indigenous cultures no longer really continue in the way they traditionally have, one major reason is their lands on which they traditionally subsisted have been taken, in most cases appropriated by outsiders. So I'm just going to read this from the 2002 from The Economist, and then we'll talk about it. No more hunting and gathering. Modern Africa leaves no space for nomads. Where I lived before, I killed animals and ate the meat. When the rain fell, I got wild fruits, but I didn't have enough water. The government asked me to move here. Dira, a man in his 70s, stands under the glaring sun in dusty New Zaid, a newly created village on the edge of Botswana's Kalahari Desert. He is one of some 2,000 Basarwa, or San Bushmen, the Kung, evicted by the government from the parched Central Kalahari Game Reserve since 1997. The Kung of the Kalahari evicted by the government from the Kalahari Game Reserve. Just a few dozen, mostly old men, remain on the reserve. One of Africa's last nomadic cultures is about to be snuffed out. Botswana's president, Festus Mogai, says that hunting and gathering is no longer a viable way of life. In New Zaid, the government provides a school, a hostel for children whose parents work on farms far away, financial compensation, boreholes for water for gardening, a new road, cattle, sheep, and welfare payments. It's the sort of official attention that few Africans enjoy. But a walk around the settlement shows that many Basarwa find modern life difficult. Alcoholism seems rife. One of the villagers' 4 policemen says assaults and drunkenness are common. To deter rising crime, goat thieves are now jailed for 5 years. And the worst thing about New Zaid, said one villager, there are no wild fruits. Okay, so you have here an example of a development project, where others have come in and tried to help through funding and projects to develop the economy, the infrastructure, water, roads, for the Basarwa who can no longer continue hunting and gathering. And the goal of this development is to improve human well-being. So they have development projects in which they provide seemingly important basic human needs, water, access to food, roads, livestock, schools, money, education. All their needs are met, if you will. But at the same time, as we can see from the last part of the excerpt, hunting and gathering is no longer viable for these people. Traditional life ways are gone, along with the identity and empowerment that goes with that. And so there's also been a lot of problems in this development. There's alcoholism now, there's crime, there's more fighting. We also saw some of this, the second half of the film, Nye, shows some of this as well, the changes the Kung underwent after contact, after being relocated off their land. And so provides things to help meet essential needs, but there's also problems. And development projects are often problematic. And so we're going to do a quick thinking exercise. This is the prompt. You're part of a team of anthropologists and filmmakers who produced the movie Nye, the Story of a Kung Woman. You've earned $500,000 from the proceeds of the movie. What would your group do with the profits made from the film? And so what I want you to do is think about this. How would you help the Kung with this money, with projects or development? Think about it. How would you help them? And then write down 2 or 3 suggestions or strategies for helping the Kung adapt to their new lives. And you're not going to turn this in, but as with all things in life, the more you put into it, the more you'll get out. So I urge you to pause the lecture, think about this for a few minutes, and jot down a couple suggestions for how you might help the Kung. Okay, so hopefully you went ahead and sort of thought about it, maybe even wrote down a couple suggestions. And typically in class, when we talk about it, the students have so many well thought out suggestions and ideas for how to help the Kung. Infrastructure, money, school, education, perhaps, into different vocations they might be interested in. Since they can no longer hunt and gather, provide them training so that they can still make a living wage, still subsist at an acceptable level. Maybe provide them land so that they can hunt and gather. All sorts of stuff, water, or give the money directly to the Kung, right? And so lots of different suggestions. And one common theme that usually emerges at the end of this exercise is almost no one ever starts by saying, what I would do is I would ask the Kung what they want and what they need. And this is a classic problem and pitfall of development and aid projects, right? Development projects often involve outsiders coming in thinking they know what's best, taking sort of an ethnocentric view, and then implementing projects based off what they think is best without even asking the people that are going to be affected by it. Not only do these projects normally fail or enjoy very limited success, they often implement the projects without even asking the people what they need or what they prefer. And so it leaves the people who think they're about to get help even more frustrated when the project fails. Outsiders come in and assume school, water, roads, land, this, that is what people need and want. And it's thoughtful and it's well-intentioned, but it may not be what people need or want. This type of development, outsiders coming in, assuming they know what's best, is ethnocentric and it is paternalistic. Sort of paternalistic, meaning we know what's best. This type of project is called top-down. Again, outsiders, experts, coming usually from the Western world, coming in, deciding what they think should happen, what would help people best according to their own assumptions, and then implement the project without even asking anyone. It's a paternalistic approach. We know what's best, paternalism. I can't tell you how many examples there are from my own field work of this happening. So just to give you a couple of examples. In Titiana, I was doing an interview with this older man, Signola, and I'll never forget exactly how he said this. And so also being this white girl, pretty much the only white person walking around the island in the majority of the country, actually, people often assumed I was working with non-government organizations, the different NGOs coming in to help with the recovery process, because pretty much every other white person on the island, that's why they were there. But I was not. I was an anthropologist. And so people would often, when I'd go do my interviews, they'd also ask me questions about, well, why did the NGO do this? Why did they do that? Because they thought I knew. I'd explain I didn't, but nonetheless. And so Signola was talking to me about this one day, and he said, why didn't they ask us what we needed? Why didn't they ask us what we wanted? I can't feed my family with a spoon. And so one of the things the NGOs handed out to people, because people lost everything, their houses, their canoes, and all their possessions, including kitchen utensils like spoons to scoop rice or whatever. And so one of the things NGOs went around and replaced was kitchen utensils, things like spoons. And so Signola says, why? Why didn't they ask? I can't feed my family with a spoon. I can feed my family with a canoe. I can go out fishing with the canoe. I can catch fish. I can come back. I can feed my family with a canoe. I can't feed my family with a spoon. I can rebuild my house with a canoe. I can't rebuild my house with a spoon. With a canoe, I can go out. I can buy fish. I can feed my family. I can take some of that fish and sell it in the market in Gizo, get a little bit of cash, buy some wood, buy a little bit of corrugated iron. Over time, rebuild my house. I can rebuild my house with a canoe. I can feed my family with a canoe. I cannot feed my family with a spoon. Why didn't they ask? And so that one example, right? Why didn't they ask? They're doling out all this stuff. It results in all this wasted resources, stuff that people don't really need. They're still living without shelter, without food, without clean water. And the NGOs are there handing out fucking spoons. I can't feed my family with a spoon. Another example in the neighboring village of Pailongue, the Melanesian village, the Papua New Guinea Salvation Army did a housing project in Solomon Islands. And that's another story, but the place that they settled on ended up being Pailongue because they have secure land tenure. The village and the chief, they own that land. There's contested land tenure in other places that makes things problematic. So they said, Pailongue it is because the land is yours, so we'll build there. And they built 15 wooden houses with labor included, corrugated iron roofs. These are like the mansions of the village, right? Water tanks on the top of the hill in Pailongue. Do you know what those houses are doing now? They're sitting there fucking empty because Pailongue villagers don't live up on the hill. The NGO came in with this whole program called Build Back Better, and we're going to build it on the hill so if a tsunami comes again, people won't be affected in the same way they were this time. While those houses are sitting up there, they're being deconstructed actually. People are taking the wood, the iron, the water tanks and moving them down the hill to the village where they actually live. If I offered to buy you a house, but it was in South Carolina and you're going to school here in San Diego, how fucking helpful is that? People don't live on the hill. Paternalism. NGOs coming in thinking they know what's best, they have good ideas, and then they implement the projects based off their own ideas, not bothering to ask the locals what they want and need. The result is lots of wasted effort and resources and frustrated people. One other example, just on Gizo, on the island of Gizo, where Titiana and Pailongue are, the main NGO working on Gizo, Oxfam, and I ended up interviewing the main Oxfam worker on the island that had been there rebuilding houses with giant air quotes around rebuilding. And so I got a chance to interview him one day. We were driving around he had a truck because he was doing construction. And I said, well, how did you decide to do housing? How did Oxfam decide that was the project? And he said, it was obvious. We just knew that's what to do. We could tell they needed houses. It was obvious. We could tell that's what they needed. Never fucking asked. And so the initial plan of Oxfam was to provide partial building materials for all the villagers so that they could rebuild their houses. And it was called an empowerment plan because not only will villagers have a new house, but they'll have been the ones that built it. And this is empowering. This will give them personal power. They can feel good about it. All this shit sounds great on paper. And so guess how many people in Titiana know how to build their own house from start to finish? Not that many, probably about as many as of us, right? So great if I gave you a bunch of wood and nails and said, here you go, could you build a house? Same for Titiana. A lot of them didn't know how to do it. So that didn't help. And also a lot of the materials they distributed ended up being rotten, like rotten wood that couldn't actually be used in the structure of the house. The result of Oxfam's shoddy project, well-intentioned, they wanted to help, but they don't fucking bother to actually ask what people need, what they want. They don't bother to understand the cultural context in which they're working. And so ultimately, out of the 75 households in Titiana, 5 houses were rebuilt. 5 in 4 years. Paternalism. We know what's best. This is a huge problem plaguing development, aid, and conservation projects, and it results in most of them failing, sometimes even making things worse. Just quick question. In class, when we do this hypothetical exercise in groups and develop projects to help the Kung adapt to their new lives, And so based off what we just talked about and this exercise, what is one of the biggest obstacles in development work? One of the biggest obstacles to development projects is the paternalistic thinking of small-scale societies, which makes change or introducing new ways of life difficult. No. B, people like the Kung do not have the expertise to start and maintain development projects. No. C, the assumption that Western development workers know what those being developed actually need and want. This assumption plagues development projects, and it is a huge problem. D, ecocentric bias, and E, development projects are always going to fail because people like the Kung have simple social structures. And that's bullshit. I just made that up. The answer is C. And this assumption that Westerners make that we know what people need and want, again, huge problem, lots of failed projects. And so there's two basic principles to offset this paternalism in development projects. And it is to repeatedly inquire and reflect upon what poor people themselves want. Ask them what they want and what they need. They have voices. Right? I can't feed my family with a spoon. Why didn't they ask us what we needed? Housing, the housing done by Oxfam. People didn't want partial building materials. People wanted canoes. They wanted to be able to go fishing. The houses in Pailongate, people don't live on the hill. So that's great. They built 15 houses up there, totally wasted when people in need are living down by the sea in the village site. So constantly, what do they actually want themselves? Ask them. And also to constantly reflect upon what these people find unacceptable. So for example, like you want to avoid violating cultural taboos, maybe having people work on certain days like Sunday, or men and women work together. So recognize the cultural situation in which you're working, and then work within it. Try as you might, and no matter how good you are at trying to offset paternalism, there's no complete escape from projecting our own ideologies and values onto the projects we do. And so if we can't escape bias, our values are always going to bleed into what we think is best. Then it leads to the question, should we even attempt to make people's lives better? Should we even get involved if there's always going to be unforeseen or adverse consequences? And you should think about that for a minute, maybe pause the lecture for a moment and think about it. Yes or no? If there's always going to be losers. There's always going to be problems. Should we even get involved, or should we just stay out? My 2 cents in answer to that question is no action is inaction, right? Plato, the penalty good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men. So if you are apathetic and not involved and you don't care, I guarantee other people will step in to fill that power role, and they may or may not share your values and your ideology. The price we pay for apathy, for doing nothing, is to be ruled by those that are willing to get involved, typically the powerful, the wealthy, which may or may not share our values, right? So if we don't do it as well-intentioned anthropologists that are primed for this type of work, it's our specialty, culture, other companies, other powerful outsiders are going to come in and do their own projects. Coca-Cola, Dole Pineapple, logging and mining companies, they will come in and do their own projects, and they'll get the chief of the village to sign some scrap of paper, even though it's not really the chief, and the chief doesn't really have the right to do that, to sign over the land, and then it belongs to the logging company or to Coca-Cola. There's nothing the rest of the villagers can do about it. I mean, this has happened in Solomon Islands. People come in, find someone that says they're the chief, pay them off, and take the land, and everyone's just screwed because formally on paper, that's what will be recognized by the Solomon Island nation state. And so if we don't do it, Coca-Cola, Dole's coming in, they're going to do it. And they definitely don't have local people's needs and desires at heart. That's not why they're there. They're there for profit. So we're going to look at a short example of an actual development project in the Dominican Republic done by the Peace Corps. And so this is not my own project, it's a colleague's of mine, but it's a good real world example of how problematic development work can be, even for a seemingly simple project when you're just trying to help in a small way. And so the Dominican Republic is located in the Caribbean. You can see that on the map. And some fundamental questions to keep in mind as we go through this example. What's development all about? What's its purpose? What's its goal? Does development result in progress or equal progress? First of all, what do we mean by progress? Running water's nice, electricity's nice. Is the fact that 1 billion people are over-consuming while another billion are malnourished and starving progress? I don't know. It depends on your values and what kind of world you want to live in. So is it progress? Does it represent improved well-being? And for who? How do we measure it? How do we measure development or progress or successful development? Do we measure it through GDP and just money, material wealth, through happiness, through people's ability to have a secure livelihood and not worry about their next paycheck or their next meal, leisure time, healthy environments, fair governance? Typically, we measure it just through money, none of these other things. And then also, who's asking for it? Are the people receiving it asking for it, or are these projects being imposed by the developed world? Like we sort of talked about from the film T-Shirt Travels, right? Hey, Zambia, we'll give you some money, we'll give you a loan to help develop your country. But then the conditions of that loan require Zambia to change their economy in ways that don't help them, drive them further into poverty, while creating further profits for the already developed countries. So who's actually asking for it? Do anthropologists know anything useful? Can we help change the world? The Peace Corps in general, for those that are unfamiliar with it, and you may look into it if you're interested in this type of work, they do projects around the world, typically in underdeveloped and developing countries, to improve human well-being, things like water, food, basic needs, education. It's a 2-year commitment, so it's a commitment. You go for about 2 years. You live on a small stipend. They pay you. A lot of people party, have an awesome time. That is cool, but also many also have a transformative experience. You go work in the third world. You do projects with education or infrastructure or agriculture to try to help the economy, with in turn helping the society. And so again, keeping in mind what's development about? Is it progress? How do we measure it? Who's it for? Who benefits? And so the project I'm telling you about, my colleague Matt Lauer did this when he was part in the Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic. And the project was to build a water system for this one village. Prior to this, the village had to go schlep water up the hill, go get it from the source, and then bring it to wherever they need it. I can tell you just from Solomon Islands, this is a pain in the ass. This is why people in Pailongue don't want to live on the hill, because it takes 40 minutes to go get a fucking bucket of water. And so the idea was build a water system, piped water for the village, improve livelihoods. Here is the infrastructure, the piping being brought in to build the water system. And one of the main things in the project was figuring out where the water line will go. Where's the water system going to go? This is important because the closer you are to it, the more of a benefit it is. The further away, the less of a benefit it is. And if development is about sort of helping the most poor, the most marginalized, but in turn ends up creating more marginalization, then what are we really doing? So where's it going to go? That was a big debate. Here is where they would trek down to get water before. And again, you can see it's a pain in the ass. It's heavy. It's muddy. It's dirty. By the time you get back to wherever you're going with your water, you've probably spilled half of it and you're probably covered in mud. Here's the cistern that they were building on the top of the hill. Most of the water basically would flow just as a function of gravity. So here's the cistern, and then here's the first use of the water system. And so a seemingly small project, bring piped water to a small village, is complex. Complex even for a small project. First, who benefited? How did it work out? There were many different interests, even in this small village. The community is not homogeneous. They have different interests, often sometimes competing interests. And so whose needs were actually met? The landowners in the village wanted the water to wash coffee as a cash crop for export, but there's not enough water for these purposes. Other people that were further from the road altogether were generally left out of the project. And the people that are furthest from the road already tended to be generally the poorest and most marginalized people. And so then with the addition of the water system, now they're far from the road, they're far from the water. The effect is the most marginalized in the community become even more marginalized. If the goal is to help marginalize, but it can create further marginalization, what are we doing? There was one example, Matt, who did the project, that they were walking around weeks into the project, and there was some household off on the outskirts of the village they came across, and he asked his informant, who's that? How come that's not on our map? And the villager said, oh yeah, don't worry about them. They were like an ethnic minority or something, that they were marginalized even within their village. So some people were left out of the project altogether. And there's also this issue of creating dependency. If outsiders come in and then leave, has local capacity actually been instilled to keep that project going? And oftentimes the answer is no. After Matt and the other workers left, the villagers wanted another volunteer, another outsider to come in and manage the water system. The same thing happened in Solomon Islands. A lot of villagers would tell me, we need an expatriate to come in and distribute aid, meaning an ex-colonist, like a white person to come in and distribute aid, because the one-tuck system's too deep in Solomon Island culture. So there's this issue of dependency. Conflict essentially ensued after the volunteers, the workers left. People were fighting over access to the water. There was a water board among the different stakeholders that had been developed to deal with this, to mitigate issues and conflicts. This dissolved, this fell apart, and ultimately people began competing over the resources. So you can see the complexity of even such a small project becomes messy very quickly. And so who benefited? Who benefits? In this project, there were winners and there were losers. Development can serve to intensify already existing inequalities. We saw this in the Bangladesh case study, Needless Hunger. The food aid that came into Bangladesh to help the rural poor ended up driving people into further poverty and making the rich richer. People that could access the food aid basically held it off the market until times were lean, and then they sold it at really high prices. So it never reached the poor. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer because of food aid. Again, my take is if we don't try to do development or improve livelihoods in the best way possible that's sensitive to the culture and the needs of the people that are being affected, someone else is coming in, and it's going to be Dole or Coca-Cola, and it won't be well-intentioned anthropologists. Development projects and development in general raises a major conceptual problem. And just a few more things before we wrap up. And so the goal of development is to improve people's lives through education or water, or healthcare, medicine, literacy, whatever it is. And so development often aims to improve economic efficiency. The idea being that increased economic output will result in raised standards of living. But maximizing economic efficiency, profits, economic growth, does not necessarily go hand in hand with social and economic well-being or improved livelihoods. There's this inherent tension between these two ideals. How do we develop or improve third world countries in impoverished regions while also ensuring an equitable redistribution of the benefits of that economic growth? And economic growth and equally distributing the benefits of it are often contradictory in unregulated capitalism. How do we typically define development? What is a developed society? How does a country or society become developed? And typically, the way we measure it is through money, income. Typically, gross national product, so the overall wealth generated per country per year, or GDP, gross domestic product, household income per year. So, for example, GDP in the U.S., this is from a year or two ago, around 57,000 annual income. In Cuba, the GDP is only 11,900, and in Solomon Islands, GDP is only 2,000. So, if we look just monetarily at GDP, this is how the countries would stack up in terms of development. And again, economic well-being is said to translate into social well-being. But is this necessarily true? And the problem is that overall income, money in the country, does not necessarily reflect the well-being of many of the people living in those borders. If you throw in a few other quantitative or qualitative indicators of life, like infant mortality rate or literacy rate or access to healthcare, the picture gets much more complex. And so infant mortality rate is just the number of children that die before the age of 1 in any given population, and it's taken out of 1,000. It's a statistical measure. And so in the US, our infant mortality rate is almost 6. And that actually, like maternal mortality rate among African American women is something like 4 times as high as among white women. And then, but if you look in Cuba, which is said to be, not developed, way less developed than the U.S., their infant mortality rate is significantly lower, 4.76. And so measuring living standards and well-being in terms of just economic indicators is problematic. It doesn't tell you much. Yet many continue to do this. You see it on the news all the time, people talking about stock market growth and the economy is doing great. How great are you feeling? How much is that benefiting you? There's a country, Bhutan, that came up with an alternative called Gross National Happiness or Better Life Index. And so instead of measuring well-being, development, progress through just GDP, which does not really indicate the overall well-being of a society, you need to bring in all these other indicators to have a holistic, more all-encompassing view of how people are doing. And so that's exactly what gross national happiness does. It looks at several different topics, several different indicators beyond wealth and money. It does look at material living conditions like housing, income, jobs, because those things do matter. If you're below the breadline and you can't eat, that's not good. But it also looks at quality of life, quality of the community, education, environmental health, good governance. Do your elected officials respond to you, or are they nepotistic and corrupt? Health, how healthy are the people? Happiness is measured. Leisure time, life satisfaction, how satisfied are you? Safety and work-life balance, sustainability. All these other things that do play a role in how we're doing overall are brought into the equation. And so if you look at just GDP or money, the US is one of the most developed countries, right? Very progressed, if you will, which is a meaningless fucking word. But if you look at gross national happiness, the U.S. is not doing very well. And it says on there, actually, the U.S. has a major problem with inequality. And that's one of the main reasons why living standards are so poor for so many. Bhutan ranks pretty high on gross national happiness. So does Sweden and a bunch of other countries. Look it up if you're interested. But it's a more holistic accounting to actually measure well-being or so-called progress. Okay, in addition to trying to measure development and well-being in a more holistic, accurate way, another trend has been to do development that takes sustainability, the environment, into account. Because if we overshoot the very resource base, the earth that supports us, that we survive on, that produces oxygen, uptakes carbon dioxide, fertilizes the soil, recycles waste. If we destroy that, the planet, we're destroying our life support system. And so development, economic and social development, needs to be done also in parallel with a mind towards environmental sustainability. Don't destroy the very environment on which our economy and society depends. And so this brings us to our last sort of topic within a topic, which is environmental anthropology. And so environmental anthropology is a subdiscipline of cultural anthropology, and it blends the natural sciences, environmental sciences, ecology, with the social sciences, with cultural anthropology. And it looks at both the social and the ecological system as a total interconnected system. Humans adapt to their environment, but also simultaneously modify and shape their environments as they live in them. And so it's about this mutual interaction throughout time and space of humans in their environments. And one of the things is through looking at this past and present human interaction in different environments, we can see which cultures have interacted sustainably with their environments and managed their resources in a way that doesn't degrade the very basis for their subsistence. And there's other examples in which cultures have not been sustainable. And so what can we learn from these different case studies to inform our own current directions in sustainability? And there's various approaches environmental anthropology takes. We'll talk a little more about that next time. But really, while we're looking at it, is how can we use environmental anthropology to help solve the environmental problems we face? And so that is what we will discuss for our next and last lecture. Take care.